In 1945, the Chicago Tribune sponsored a small house competition with the intent to see some winning designs materialize in built houses. The parameters of the contest attest to the architectural and social norms of the day, and so did the houses built from winning designs. Over the years, the houses have been altered, demonstrating how the evolution of house design reflects and shapes our assumptions about how people live. Siobhan Moroney is the author of Chicagoland Dream Houses: How a Mid-Century Architecture Competition Reimagines the American Home, and professor at Lake Forest College in the Department of Politics and International Relations and in the American Studies program. And with that, please enjoy the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol, for the invitation. Thank you, George, for all the work that you've done putting this program together. I want to start by talking about the housing shortage that we tend to think of as a wartime problem, but I want to present it actually as a Depression era problem. The crisis in housing in the United States came with the Depression. So they went about a decade where they really didn't build much of anything unless you were wealthy and you could hire an architect and have it built on your own. And even during that time, everyone knew there was a housing shortage. It just got exacerbated during World War II. And the housing shortage was pretty awful. Again, there was very little building, and what little building was either rental or housing for war workers. So for almost 12, 13 years, demographers, sociologists, the United States government, we knew that there was going to be a housing crisis when the war came to an end, and that was just going to get worse. And so something was going to happen. So there's a lot of focus on the post-war housing boom. They know there's going to be a boom. What they didn't imagine was the baby boom. And so we often think that the baby boom drives the housing. It's not that at all. And in fact, there are some who thought at the time that fertility rates would actually go down even more, and that the family sizes after World War II would be smaller than, than they ended up being. So there's an expectation of a housing boom. And in that context, that's why a competition to jumpstart housing makes a lot of sense. So the Chicago Tribune announced that it was going to have a housing contest. It was designed specifically to be for modest middle-income housing. They give $1,000 per winner, and they have 3 categories of competition. The Tribune had done previous competitions. If you know anything at all about Chicago architecture, you might know something about the Tribune Tower competition of 1923, but they also held a small housing competition in 1926. So this was on their minds. There are a lot of other competitions that are happening at the same time, but the Tribune is really the only newspaper, one of the only couple newspapers to ever do anything like this and on this scale. So there are a lot of contemporary competitions by which we can compare and see the ways in which the Tribune competition was different from or similar to other things that are going on. Now, when it came time to get this competition going, they have these announcements. They announce in some architectural journals as well. And if you wanted to apply to the competition, you had to first write to get a rules booklet. The rules booklet outlined more specifically the 3 problems. And problems is their word. It doesn't mean problem in the way that we think. It's just what solutions are you trying to come up with? So look here. Notice that the smallest home for a family with just 1 child is still 1,100 square feet, which is pretty big by the standards of what eventually came. Notice the heteronormativity. Of course, it's a mother and a father and the children's ages and sexes are specified. And we'll talk about why that's important, because it turns out to be quite important. Think about the ways that this is a normative and valuative precept, right? It is better to own a home than to rent a home. It is better to have a single family home on a separate lot. Families here are exactly 2 generations. Even though we know that's not how at the time, subsequently, and now lots and lots of Americans live. The rule is parents and children only. And note as well that these aren't even parents of infants. The youngest child on here is 6 years old in 1945. That's a pre-war baby. Okay? So once again, they're not really imagining quite yet the babies that are coming. When you wrote off for the rules competition, you wrote to the advisor, and that advisor was architect Boyd Hill, whose kitchen is on display in the exhibit in there. And the reason that they had this advisor is because there's a long history of a lot of cheating and graft and appropriation of architectural designs. And so there were actual rules and guidelines. And one was to have a non-voting advisor who managed the competition, and that was Hill. You wrote off for the program, and you would be mailed the program, but that also put your name and address on file. As I'm doing the research, I'm thinking, oh, the program, no one will ever have a copy of that. But Marcel Breuer was a saver, and God bless him. It's in his archive. And if you notice that someone has calculated some square footage on there, I'm assuming that that's Breuer. I like to think that it's Breuer. And this is a 14, 15 page booklet with all the very specific rules. Now, the Tribune was really clear. Anybody can submit to this competition. They encourage people who weren't architects to submit, and people who weren't architects did submit. Boyd Hill was quoted as saying that one person just drafted, on a piece of paper his own house and sent it in. But the rules also specified very clearly what size paper you had to have, the scale, the margins. You didn't have to have working plans, but you had to have a plot plan. You had to have elevations, etc. So it's pretty unlikely that anybody who was not an architect or a designer was going to do well in this competition. But we'll get to that in a minute, because there was one non-architect who was a winner. Another submission came from Winston Elting, and Winston Elting's wife is also in the exhibit there. She's in a newspaper article that's on the wall, so you can look for her. There are plenty of smart and famous people who submitted. Breuer, Marion Mahoney Griffin, Ralph Rapson, Morgan Yost, I.M. Pei, fresh out of grad school, sent in a co-design submission with his wife. They all lost. When the winners were chosen, they included 8 winners from each of the 3 categories for a total of 24 winners. And the Tribune, of course, is always trying to build up content. Imagine this in color on the Sunday section. For weeks in advance, they told people it was coming. They reminded people that they should save their colored sections of the paper, and you could have them all at the very end. And so they did this 5 successive Sundays in a row. And this began in February. And the Trib really flogged this as much as possible. The announcement came in September. The deadline was in December, and in January they announced the winners, and they had something in almost every single day for the next many, many months, reminding people about this, and we'll get to the building project in a minute. One of the things that they did is they commissioned professional artists to do professional renderings, and a rendering is this kind of a elevation, and they're actually quite beautiful. Here's one. When they commissioned these, and then they subsequently, these designs and these watercolor paintings went on exhibit, and they traveled around in department stores and banks and libraries and community centers in Illinois, Milwaukee, all around the Midwest. They were in some bunch of department stores. And Coder Taylor designed this house. He's an architect who died, I think, in the late 80s. But there's an oral archive at the Art Institute, and he was interviewed, and he told the story about how he ended up with the painting. And he said one day, all the paintings had ended up at the School of Architecture that was University of Illinois at Navy, it's on Navy Pier, and a secretary calls him up one day, a secretary at the architecture school, and says, "We have your drawing, do you want it?" And he said he did. And so he came down to Navy Pier and he gets it, and he sees a pile of other paintings. And he asked, "Well, what are you going to do with these?" And they said, "Oh, we're just probably going to throw them away." And he said, "I'll take them." And he scoops them up and he donated them to the Art Institute upon his death. So the Art Institute owns 7 of those paintings. It means there's others out there that probably, I don't know, I think grandkids and grandkids said, "What the heck is this?" And probably threw them away. This house is built in Highland Park. There's only one that I know of, but it's in Highland Park, still stands teeny tiny. It's a little tiny 2-bedroom house that the current owners love, but they're assuming that when it's time for them to leave, that somebody's going to buy it and tear it down and put up a bigger house. Here's one by Charles Schroeder. I just love this one. Look how modern and sleek it looks. There's a version of this house in Portage Park. And then this is a house by Garba, and this Garba house is in Deer Park, which is subdivision that's in West Rogers Park now. So that house still stands. We'll see another picture of it in a minute. One of the things that happened at the same time that the Tribune is starting to announce these winners in their Sunday paper, there is an Art Institute exhibit. And they are so slow on the Art Institute exhibit because they haven't finished all the renderings, that the exhibit starts with a few, and as the month goes on, they just keep adding and adding and adding. So it's sort of a rolling exhibition. They had done this for the Tribune Tower competition. They had done this for the 1926 competition as well. The numbers suggest that 90,000 people came to the Chicago to Art Institute during that month, and while there visited this exhibit. It was free most days at the time, so it would have been pretty easy to get in. In 1948, long after the competition was over, the Tribune published a book. And sorry, oh, that's a picture of the Art Institute exhibit as well. That's the then governor at the time. Okay. This is the Prize Homes book, the book that was published in 1948. And it includes 92 houses. So it's 24, the 24 winners, and then a bunch of others. And I'll show you here that it looks sort of like this. Each page, one page is devoted. And this book was in libraries all around the country. It went for sale all around the country. It is in libraries all over the country. And that is how I found about the competition. So I was working on a piece on children's bedrooms, because I started out by writing about architecture of the vernacular home and how it shapes family relations. So for example, when did we start to have what has been called the master bedroom, and why? What does that have to say about marriage? What's the purpose there? And then I was asking about children's bedrooms. When did Americans start to think that it was the normal thing for children to have their own rooms? And in doing so, in doing all this research, I just went through tons and tons and tons of plan books, okay, catalogs, plan books, magazines, etc. And I came across Prize Homes. And I used it in my research even before I really read the introduction to the book. And that's when I found out that it was a competition. And I thought to myself, what competition? So I start flipping around and looking. Nobody knows anything about this competition. It's huge in its day. There is an 800-page history of the Chicago Tribune that never mentions it. There's no history of architecture in Chicago mentions it. No history of post-war housing in the United States mentions it at all. So that's how I ended up becoming the keeper of the Prize Homes. But this book, it had a very large circulation, and I'm pretty sure that some of the built houses were chosen from the book. I'm pretty sure that at least one in Highland Park was selected that way. So the houses were meant to be modest. This is really, in some ways, one of the most modest ones. It's under 1,000 square feet. And it was built 3 times. There's one in Chicago that is currently in existence. There was one in Palatine that was torn down. It's now an empty lot. And then there's one in Kankakee that's largely unchanged. Here's another one by Eric Wenstrand. When I wrote the book, I knew of the first 5. After the book was in press, I learned of another one, and I'm assuming that there are others dotted around the Midwest and in Illinois too. So one of the things I look at in my book is I ask the question, what makes a house a modern one? Because when we think of post-World War II architecture, we do think of modern architecture, and you can see that in the exhibit there, sort of modern, sleek-looking houses. And I do a lot of analysis of house design. Where do rooms go? What is the role of the automobile in the second half of the 21st century? It makes the garage not an afterthought, but necessarily integrated into the architecture of the house. I noted that of all these designs in the Price Home book, all but one has a fireplace. Okay? And so fireplaces are expensive, they add labor costs, and yet somehow designers thought that they were still absolutely necessary to have this kind of family experience. I look a lot at multi-generational placement. Where are the places that adults belong in the house? Where do children belong in the house? I look at privacy. How does one get privacy within the home? You do that through zoning. You put bathrooms and bedrooms in one part of the house and public areas in the other. But you also need privacy from your neighbors. And remember, these are on small lots, but have big windows. And so you've got this kind of always these cross-competing things, right? That you don't want your neighbors looking in your windows and looking in on your business, but you also need those windows because you got a small house and then you need it to make it look bigger. Okay, so one of the things you can see in this, do you see these front windows in this house? That's the front living room. Lets in tons and tons of light, big lights. But the rest of the house is much more modestly windowed in the back. And every one of the houses of this iteration that I have found has been built on a corner lot. This is a modern house. This is what architects liked in this time period. So architects, if you flip through Architectural Forum or Architectural Record or California Arts and Architecture, what do architects want? They want to build modern, sleek houses with big window walls, flat roofs. They're happy with the attached or even the protruding garage. Very, very minimalist. Okay? And so if you look at competitions that are judged by architects, this is the kind of house, or this style of house is the kind that won all the prizes. But what did Americans actually want? They wanted houses that looked like this, right? Architects don't want to build houses like that. People have been doing that for a long time. But you know who wants to build this house? Builders want to build this house because they think it's going to sell. Notice how traditional this house, the peaked roof, the dormer windows, the shutters, the cross and Bible front door. It does have an attached garage, which makes it a little bit modern. And there's a big contest or conflict at the time. You've got this one group of people saying modern, modern, modern. And then you've got this other group of people, builders, bankers, the Federal Housing Authority saying, maybe you can't resell it. It's going to stick out in your neighborhood. It's not a good investment. People don't know how to build it. So there's this real skepticism when it comes to modern architecture. One of the things then that's interesting about the Prize Homes competition is that it had both builders and architects on the jury. And that made it distinct. And I think that also is why it ended up with the choices that it did, because you don't find a house that looks too much like this in the prize home. You find some, okay? You don't find any house that looks like that in the prize homes competition. So what you end up is this house that was called in its time a modern colonial. I did not make up that term, but somebody did and used it over and over. This is a house by Howard Ubelhack, and this is a version that was built in Highland Park and is still in Highland Park. You can see even here that when built, it deviates from the original, right? So the original has these shutters, but it also has glass brick. It has an attached snout garage. It's got a big plate window. So it really maybe, and it looks like a ranch house, okay? But it really is in some ways a modern colonial, that it's not too off-putting, it's traditional enough that's kind of gonna fit anywhere. But you can see when it was built, that somebody made a side window. So no shutters on that one, although there are shutters on some other versions of it. Modern houses at this time rely on some specific architectural elements internally. So one of the things that has been going on since the turn of the last century is what to do with the dining room. Okay. Why do we need a dining room? A dining room is pretty expensive. It uses a lot of real estate that could be devoted to something else. And so even in the teens and 20s, they already started opening up the dining room to the living room, maybe by half walls, maybe by double doors or a double wide doorway that doesn't have any doors on it at all. A lot of times it's an L. You walk into the living room and then you turn a corner. I know you're nodding because you know houses like this. You have houses like this where you turn, and then from that you actually can get into the kitchen. So at this time, no one is really opening up a kitchen. But in these houses, you have a good number that are living dining rooms. That totally open space. It is only a couple of places in this entire competition where I can see that there is a separate dining room that would be accessed through a separate door, maybe through another hallway. That's gone. That's pretty much gone the way of the dodo. It's interesting to think about dining rooms today. Most Americans would say that they don't really need a dining room. It's not worth it to have something that they only use 2-3 times a year, if at all. Although with COVID, our affection for walls and doors grew significantly, right? Because suddenly everyone is at Zoom school or Zoom work. And if all of the rooms in your house are open to each other and flow into each other, it's a lot harder to come on privacy, quiet. That's why so many people ended up retreating to their bedrooms in order to get privacy and to get work done. So these modern houses, they all have garages. They all have pretty utilitarian kitchens. They all focus on storage, lots of cabinet space, storage in the garage. Not all of them have basements, but many of them have basements. They pay attention to play space for children. Because it's so close to the war, to the conclusion of the war, almost all of them have on the plot plans notices where the garden will be. The vegetable garden will be. Within just a few years, the vegetable garden is, of course, going to disappear. And in fact, maybe viewed as kind of too working class for most genteel people. But even in the largest homes, the 3-bedroom homes, in the biggest category, they still had gardens labeled on the plot plan. So inside a modern floor plan, okay, and every child pretty much gets a separate bedroom. Okay? And that's true even in the houses where you had 2 daughters. Okay. So in the problem 3, you have a 12-year-old son, you have an 8-year-old daughter, and you have a 16-year-old daughter. Now that is a situation where the girls could have shared a room, but most of the time they don't. So we see more and more this norm that children will have their own rooms. In the family problem number 2, where you have 2 children, the children are a boy and a girl. They never share a room. Right? So we already see this. They never share a room. So we never see opposite sex room sharing. And we very little even see same sex room sharing. Of course, parents had their own room. It was designated. This is still before the rise of the master bathroom. Okay, so it's not yet a suite, but it is a specific room. It's the largest room. It's usually designated either in the copy as the parents' room, or you can just tell from amenities in the drawings on the floor plans. What they missed is the TV room, because it's 1945 and they're really close, but they're just not quite close enough. Some of them have rumpus rooms and recreation spaces in the basement, but the TV room, family room is not yet standard. It's common, but you're not going to find it in this particular competition because it's just a little too early. What really makes this competition distinctive is that the Tribune wanted to build houses. Now, most architectural competitions of this sort were what are called ideas competitions. They were often meant for architectural publications just to fill their pages. It was a way of giving architects something to do during the Depression when they didn't have any commissions, so they could do this. And so there were lots and lots of competitions. A lot of times they were sponsored by building materials, bricks or white pine or ceramic tile. Sometimes they were sponsored by utilities. So General Electric had a famous one, et cetera. But those were just put the idea on paper, et cetera. The Tribune said, we want to build houses. Because that was the whole point, right? We have a housing shortage. And so they intentionally said they didn't want it to be an ideas competition. And they initially had a plan to build 144 houses in Chicago and Chicago suburbs. I think I'm up to maybe 30 that I know of. Not all 30 are still in existence. And some places, I'm pretty sure they're in a town, but I don't have an address, so I don't have any other way to look for them. After World War II came to an end, there were 100,000 homeless vets in Chicago. Now, homeless doesn't necessarily mean living on the side of the road, but people who wanted housing and couldn't procure it. There are people living in hotels. There were people who had moved back in with their families. There were people who were sharing houses with other families. It was pretty much of a crisis. There's a great story about people were ripping off people say, hey, here's a house, you can rent this, and then they take their 6 months rent money, and it turns out it wasn't for rent at all. This is just a scam. People would sleep in the lobby of the Chicago Tribune on Saturday nights so that they could get the first crack at the Sunday morning paper to get the real estate listings because they were so desperate. These are young people with families. And so there's desperate need. Now, when the competition was first announced, it didn't specify that the housing would go to veterans, but by the time they start groundbreaking in June of 1946, it is. So the plan here is that we're going to build houses, and the houses are going to be for veterans. There is some sort of Chicago Tribune building project mystery that I can't find. I think this was probably run out of somebody's back pocket, and maybe doesn't behoove us to look too closely at how this was administered. But somehow builders were partnered with vets, and so vets would maybe choose the house, maybe not. But they had these groundbreaking ceremonies. They were covered by the newspaper. They were covered by the radio station, WGN. And so here's one in Lombard. Right. There was a house here. So James McDaniel, who's a veteran, they would highlight the veteran spouse, their kids, etc. And so they had 6 stories of groundbreaking, and in 5 of them, they were paired with a specific named veteran who would then, upon completion, move in. Okay. Groundbreaking 1946 seems like you're on your way to living in a house. When the houses were finished, the Tribune arranged to have open houses and to furnish them. And so 10 houses were all built in one spot in West Rogers Park. And I'll talk more about that in a minute, but the people who live in that house now are only the second owners of the home, and they had inherited from the first owners a framed poster that is the Sears owned promotion of the decoration of their home. It's interesting. It's a very modern house, but look at all the chintz and the kind of colonial stuff, right? So the decoration of these houses kind of all over the place with modern and colonial and, you know, all kinds of a mishmash. So they would furnish houses and then they would open them up for a month for people to come in and see. And they would get it down to put pajamas on the bed and food in the refrigerator. They had all these sponsors. And people had done that a little bit previously, but the Tribune really, really promoted it and pushed it in a way that I think you don't really see too much. You see it later after the parades of homes, et cetera, but it's still a relatively new thing at the time. The open house in Palatine, when this house was this is the Arthur Sackville West House. You can just see people just coming in all day, all day. And this would be for a month. 10 houses were built. It was called the Deer Creek subdivision. It was it had been a brickyard and some farming. And so it was one of the last available parcels of land in the Chicago city limits that had never been built on. So somebody bought it and got Boyd Hill to pick 10 houses and site the houses. And they were all built at once. They're all still there. Many of them are kind of unrecognizable, but some of them are not. So if you're interested, I'll give you the street corners. You can go and drive by. And these houses were opened for a month. They were fully furnished. They had cars in the garage. This is coming out in, oh, I think that date is wrong. Well, that's when they started. Okay, so it opens up in later, and it's right ahead of the WGN television station. And so the TV station is there for the first time. They had so many people that the Red Cross ended up having a booth there. I knew that they were handing things out, but I thought, I'll never be able to have it. But some of the owners of these houses had it handed down to them. So I have some pamphlets from the time, which was just an enormously wonderful find for me. So let's hear it for the savers and the hoarders in the world. So don't go home and clean out that file. This just is an example of just they had accountants with little tickers to count. They think their estimate was that 200,000 people saw that in 1 month. Okay? And I don't think you can see it on this, but I don't think the street is paved yet. And I interviewed a lot of residents of these houses, and one of them told me that the street just ended. Okay. But their yards went way in because the street hadn't yet been paved. So she said in the early years, they just had these big old yards, and then eventually the street came and ate up a bunch of their yard. An owner, a child who grew up in one of these houses said that there was so little built environment surrounding this at the time that her older sister could walk to school and her mother would stand on the second floor, and she put her daughter in a red hat and she could see her all the way to the steps of the school. And that's how she knew she got in safely every day. So this Deer Park subdivision really in some ways is sort of the biggest single cluster of houses. In Lombard, there are 2 right across from each other. In Highland Park, there were 4, and now there are 3 within a few block radius. But a lot of these houses are also quite spread apart. And if it was meant to be a model for how to invigorate a neighborhood and build a lot of houses that people could live in, it was a big, big failure. One of the things that happened is that they jumped the gun. In 1946, they ground break, and they don't have, they have the laborers, but they don't yet have the materials, and the supply chain is broken down, and they just, so it just takes months and months and months. And what I discovered is that none of the named veterans who were at the groundbreaking ceremonies ever moved into those houses. Okay? Because it was a year and a half later. And, you know, one family was living in a motel and they just had a kitchen down the hall and they can't wait. They had a little kid. They couldn't wait. In addition, the houses turned out not to be inexpensive. Plus, they all cost twice as much. So that little tiny Sackville West house, that one right here, okay, that's the one that's under 1,000 square feet. So when it went for sale in 1947, it was $18,000. But even half that, $9,000, would have been a lot of money. And that's one of the ways also in which this housing market was just completely botched, in that returning vets pretty much said consistently they'd actually prefer to rent right away. And nobody was building any rental housing. So this competition did not solve the housing problem at all. What solved it was rental units. And then eventually, when people started building developments of smaller houses that were all alike, one after another, where you could just have supply efficiencies and labor efficiencies and more modest housing, that's what brought the price down. So I looked at census data, and the people who lived in these houses in 1950 were lawyers and business owners and people who were clearly at the upper levels of the economic spectrum. So I finally want to end up with talking about house evolution, and house evolution comes in a couple of ways. One is the gap between the design and the builder. And here you can see that kind of funky modern house on the left by Charles Schroeder, and look at the way it was built. The windows were centered. I don't know if that bay window was there initially. That I kind of think that was added later. But look how conventional it looks. It looks just like those Chicago houses that we call Georgians, that are not Georgian, but that's what we call them, right? On the side, you can still see with the glass, there is the kind of a glass brick. That house has just been bumped out the back. So there's a huge 2-story addition on the back of it. It was a very modest 3-bedroom home. It's now a 4-bedroom home. It's a master suite, has a very big dining room, a big back deck. It's got a two car garage accessible from an alley. Here's one. This is the cedar sand house at the top. This is the one, first of all, you can see they built it in reverse. Do you see that's the opposite? It's one of the reasons why it is so hard to identify houses when you're trying to drive around the block and figure out which one is which. And so that's the first change that they made. But then you could also see in the front that they added on the second floor addition above the garage. What you can't see from this photo is that they've also bumped out the back and they've gone down. So this house started out as a 2.5 bath, 3-bedroom house with one long living dining room and a kitchen. It's now a 5-bedroom, 4-bathroom house with a giant family room in the back, and it has one of the bedrooms is in the basement level. And they have they're Orthodox Jewish, and they have a kosher kitchen. So they have the kitchen and then another kitchen in the basement. Okay, so that house is just much bigger than it appears from the outside. This one, I couldn't get my mind around this one, because I knew that this house was I knew that the top one was supposed to be there, and I thought, well, they tore it down, or they never really built it, or I couldn't figure out, and I finally figured out that they bumped right out the front. That's pretty unusual. So do you see this the drawing has the push out, the snout garage? They just built around that. And so that bedroom, that house was a modest 3-bedroom, 2 bedrooms and a tiny little 3rd bedroom, 1.5 bathrooms. It did have a basement, still has a basement. And that house now is a 5-bedroom, 4 or 5 bathroom house. Just huge, just up, out in every direction. And part of the reason is because our standards of houses have changed, right? Nobody wants a 2-bedroom house. 2-bedroom houses get torn down. Even 3-bedroom houses are pretty tiny. Okay. Nobody wants a 1.5 bathroom house. Everybody needs at least 2 full bathrooms, if not more. Okay. That television room is now obsolete, but we still want to have family rooms. Our kitchens are twice as big as they used to be. A one-car garage does not cut it for anybody in a middle-class home, and really even a two-car garage is on the tiny side because we all go to Costco. And we buy 4,000 rolls of paper towels at a time. And seriously, there's studies that show that that's why we can't put our cars in there. We got so much stuff in our garages that we cannot put the cars in there anymore. Specifically to this neighborhood in Deer Park, what is an interesting thing to me is that the neighborhood was a Jewish neighborhood when it started, but the people who lived there were largely assimilated Jews or Reform Jews, and so wasn't particularly, they wanted to live in a Jewish neighborhood, but they didn't need to be close to Jewish. They just sent their kids to regular schools. They get in their cars and drive when they needed to drive, etc. Over time, this neighborhood in West Rogers Park has retained its Judaism, but it is now Orthodox and Haredi Jews. And if you think about that, their house use is actually quite different from most Americans. They have more children. Okay, so they need more bedrooms and more bathrooms than even the average American household. They drive less, so there's less, they don't care as much about a garage, but they love their dining rooms. And that's one of the things that was just fascinating to me. There is one house that had a big dining room. They added a dining room back. One woman who lives in a house all by herself, that's a 4-bedroom house. She has a dining room that holds 26 people. And every Saturday, she hosts lunch there for her extended family, children, spouses, and grandchildren, and now their children, etc. So I'm now very interested in religion and architecture and how religiosity and faith practices may influence people's architectural needs. Lastly, I just want to say that it was just a great treat to go knocking on people's doors. I mean, this white lady with a clipboard, trying to get people to talk to me, and it's post-COVID, but just post-COVID, and people were so kind and so generous and gave me things and let me tour their houses, or would let me tour the downstairs and say, but the upstairs is too messy, you can't go in there. Or they talked to me, and they talked to me about their neighbors, and they gossip about their neighbors, and it was just lovely. This is a house that we've already seen once, and you can't really tell very well, but if you look closely, you can see some little footprints that are walking into this. That was their birth announcement for their daughter, who was born in, I think, 51. And so she's the one who lent me this image. This is what the house looks like otherwise in the drawing. So it was a great research project in that respect, and the most fun being able to talk to people. So thanks so much. I hope you love your home as much as these people love theirs, and I'm happy to take questions.